I think it's great to hear many different perspectives. You all have different experiences and disciplinary backgrounds, and I think it's good to have this variety of perspectives. But I also see a common thread here that I want to elaborate on, and maybe also zoom out in our discussion and focus our discussion maybe on a bit of a wider perspective. And that came out, James, when you were mainly talking about the Global Compact for Refugees, and you drew attention to the historical context of the refugee protection regime, and you started out with the problem of the discretion that the discretion that individual states have had and continue to have. And I think I would frame this as well, thinking of the issue of sovereignty as being a problem, and I think that came out in Howard's comments as well. Jenna, in your discussion, you focused mostly on the Global Compact for Migration, but also you had experience with involvement in the Global Compact for Refugees, your discussion focused on gender and not just the binary gender categories. And you also said that there might have been a missed opportunity to include more progressive approaches that are not apparent in the compact and are certainly not implemented. And I wonder, you have experience and some insights in the process itself. I wonder in the negotiations to what degree was the insistence again on sovereignty, was that a problem in leaving it out? And then Howard, you nailed it, I think, talking mostly about the Global Compact for Refugees again, and you start out with this international relations theory, which states that states act in their national self-interest, and also that currently we see this growing nationalism that heads in the same direction, and that trend contributes to probably a weakening of the Global Compact's aims and implementations of the intentions, but also probably shape the Global Compact's texts in the first place. And then I really like your hypothesis at the end, whether the Global Compacts might have done more harm than good because of that. To me, there's an overarching fundamental contradiction embedded in the Global Compacts for Migration and the Global Migration and Refugees. And you may recall that several countries rejected the Global Compact for Migration because it would infringe upon their sovereignty. Among those countries were Austria, Hungary, Israel, Poland, and the United States. And I pulled up a quote here from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, who said at the time that it's a duty to protect Israel's borders. Along the same lines, the US ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, said at the time that the compact is simply not compatible with US sovereignty. The fundamental contradiction to me is that the UN and the IOM and UNHCR are organizations of sovereign member states, and these states claim their sovereignty to protect their borders, manage their populations, control human mobility in the first place. And one of the guiding principles of the Global Compact of Migration, for example, is explicitly to affirm national sovereignty. So the compacts were also seen in a way as a threat to national sovereignty. And what's really interesting is that in my own research, I came across, or I found that migration and refugee politics and policies are actually one of the primary ways and policy fields in which sovereignty is articulated, claimed, and enacted. So states not only say, because we are sovereign, we can decide on our own what kind of migration policies and laws we want to implement, and refugee policies as well, but also in a way that we claim to be sovereign by the way that we design our policies and our immigration and refugee policies. So for example, by violating our own moral and ethical principles, when it comes to migration and refugee policy, we can demonstrate to be independent sovereign actors in the first place. And that, for example, just to provide you a few examples, the Trump administration's Muslim ban violated the kind of principles that would have been impossible to implement within the US. But when it comes to immigration policy, the policy says, well, yes, we can discriminate based on religion. The Canadian immigration policy openly discriminates based on education, class, and age, for example. That's something that within Canada wouldn't be possible. So I think without such enactments, state sovereignty would actually not really exist. It would be an elusive idea. So states have to demonstrate that they are sovereign, and immigration and refugee policy does actually a very important job in doing that. And the contradiction then is that member states and their sovereignty claims are actually part of the problem. And one of the questions that I would raise here is whether this is where we actually should look for solutions. So it's an inherent contradiction in the organization or in the underlying organization of the Global Compact for migration refugees. There might be some other novel approaches for finding solutions outside of the nation-state framework. I think this is not the place to have this discussion. I'm involved in looking at solutions in a project that looks at solutions at the local scale, for example, looking at cities, in which case the claims to national sovereignty might not stand in the way of finding these kind of solutions. But in contrast, just coming back to the Global Compact for Refugees, for example, paragraph 97 says explicitly local integration is a sovereign decision. So again, the idea of sovereignty is creating is erecting a huge barrier to finding solutions.